Real animals exist in the Pokemon world, but their presence is so well hidden that most don't notice or they simply forget. And when you see them, it begs the question, are these Pokemon too? Hi, my name is Professor AlphaLax and I like to talk about Pokemon. This is something that doesn't get brought up too often in the Pokemon fandom, so I thought it would be fun to explore this concept. Some of you may be wondering, what is this guy talking about? Well, some newer fans may not have known about this since the Pokemon Company has shown this phenomenon less and less in recent years, but there used to be real animals depicted in the show many times in the early years, and it still happens occasionally today. Game Freak have even started changing Pokédex entries to reflect a more canon continuity. But let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. To start, let's talk about the first instance that stood out to me as a kid. When Ash first gets to the Cerulean Gym, there is a moment where fish are shown in a tank. I remember thinking to myself back in the day, wait a minute, those aren't Pokemon. I mean, they look like regular fish, so obviously they couldn't be Pokemon. But Magikarp and Goldeen are also just fish. But why would those be considered Pokemon and not these? There were many, and I mean many, examples of this in the original anime series, such as the worm Pidgey eats in the first episode, or the lobster that was served on the SS Anne. And I mean, yeah, it makes sense. The original generation of Pokemon just did not have enough creatures to flesh out the entire world. So it's understandable. I mean, think about it. What if there were only 150 animals in our world? Wouldn't that be sad? I mean, you would take a walk in the park and see the same 2 birds, the same 2 mice, only 1 snake, 1 butterfly, and whatever this is supposed to be. But of course, that's only if we compare the Pokemon world to our world. Maybe it's a good thing there wasn't as many at first for the people of Kanto. I mean, I guess I'm glad there isn't a giant pincer bug in my backyard. So what we established is that the reason for doing this was probably that the creators of the anime didn't have any Pokemon to reference when making gags and jokes in the original series. Some more early examples are when Ash wears a cow costume. Well, Miltank didn't exist yet. Or when Ghastly creates an illusion of a mongoose to scare Ekans. Makes sense as Zangoose wasn't a thing yet. But then we have some examples of them using real-life animals when they didn't have to. Like a horse being on a merry-go-round when Ponyta exists. Or a crab being on a billboard when Krabby exists. Well, there is an even simpler explanation as to why the animators did this. Takeshi Shudo, the original director of the Pokemon anime, claimed that the real animals went extinct in the Pokemon world years ago and no longer exist. He claimed that the instances of real-world animals appearing in early episodes of the anime were due to the animation staff not paying close enough attention. Okay, so if that's the case, then... well, that just leaves me with more questions. So the references to animals would make sense. Real-world animals and crabs are extinct. People in the Pokemon world would probably reference extinct creatures in a similar way that we reference dinosaurs and mammoths today. But what exactly happened to them? How did the animals in their world go extinct all at once? Unless they were wiped out by the Pokemon. Maybe they were simply all eaten. After all, they wouldn't have the capability to defend themselves without the elemental powers that the Pokemon have. I guess all the animals in our world would just be the normal type. Well, I guess normal and poison type. And flying type. And in some cases fighting type. Alright, so all the animals have gone extinct. Well, how do you explain the fish in the tank? Well, those are actually ancient creatures that have somehow lived until the present day. So let's move on to the more recent generations of Pokemon. I've always liked how the world seems more filled out in the newer games. For example, in Scarlet and Violet, as you're riding along, you can encounter many different types of similar Pokemon. You can find Starly, Fletchling, Rookidee, Oricorio, Wingull, Wattrel, Swablu, and many others. It's not just the same 2 bird Pokemon anymore. The Pokemon world actually feels like a real ecosystem now, closer to the real world. And there's not just 1 cat Pokemon anymore, there's several. Okay, so it makes sense that going forward, the anime team would use less and less real-world animals as references, as there are more Pokemon to use as references instead. But every now and then they still do it, albeit to a lesser extent, such as an episode in the Sun and Moon series. They used a starfish and a clamshell on a bucket that Mimikyu was wearing. And okay, it's either one of 2 things, that clams and starfish still exist and manage to not go extinct, or that they are extinct, but the people in the Pokemon world just like making references to old extinct creatures. After all, they could have used a Staryu and a Shelter here, but they didn't. So in conclusion, animals in the Pokemon world actually exist, but they are not very common. And most were only used because Game Freak and the Pokemon Company had no other alternatives. But they have actually gone back and retconned a few things, like Raichu's Pokédex entry for example. It used to say that it was capable of causing an Indian elephant to faint. In Sword and Shield, the Indian elephant bit was replaced by a Copperajah. Well, anyway, that's all I have to talk about today, but if you liked this video or thought it was interesting, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more Pokemon content. If you have anything to add, please leave a comment down below. Take care.